On April 3rd, 2020, we saw the release of Resident Evil 3's remake. This came a year after its sibling remake, Resident Evil 2, which released in 2019. While the reception for both games varied, generally the first of the two remakes in this duo, that of course being Resident Evil 2, was received far more positively, and a lot of this stemmed from the utilisation of their respective original releases and the foundations that they set in place for their remakes. The original Resident Evil 3 was very well received by the community and still to this day has a very strong following. There are many factors as to why this was, but a lot of what made the game was the atmosphere the game was able to create, combining the streets of Raccoon City with a deadly rocket-wielding tyrant hunting you down. It had a diverse set of locations, killer soundtrack and branching pathways, and that's just to name a few. And while the remake followed in its footsteps with many similar story beats, it was clear that Capcom wanted to retcon the story and take a different approach. The development for the remake of Resident Evil 3 started a little after the development started for the remake of Resident Evil 2. It involved a few members of staff that were involved with the production of the original RE3 and gave them an opportunity to rebuild their vision of how Raccoon City should look and how the events involving Jill Valentine should take place. Due to the timing of these games and their development windows, they tried to make the games more connected, given they take place in a very close time frame, with some events even taking place at the same time in the game's universe. Nemesis would have a bunch of iterations, and given the amount of forms he has in the remake, I can only imagine how many concept iterations they actually had. In addition to that, Carlos was also made more of a focus in the story, including how he interacted with Jill, and overall the story as a whole was made more focused and streamlined, which was a slightly different approach to what the original was trying to achieve, but I will elaborate on this when we go through the reasons of how it could have been improved. Improving the final build of the remake can be quite a lengthy discussion, as you may or may not have already seen through forums and other videos going over this topic, but for the sake of trying to keep it nice and concise, I will try my best to keep the list short and focused. Starting that list off, we have the exploration. The original RE3 offered a multitude of locations, with the most prominent cut locations being the Clock Tower and Raccoon Park. In the remake, many locations are either completely cut, condensed, or briefly seen, and this was very damaging to the remake, given it already had the foundations laid out for it by the original, and it was laid out in an excellent fashion, so they just needed to simply modernise the location's aesthetics and modify it to fit the over-the-shoulder gameplay. Many would go on to criticise the release for this very reason, and I feel like this was something they could have easily avoided if they just went with the safe route and made sure everything from the original was there to a decent capacity. Adding on to that exploration point, we have the lack of city. Resident Evil 2 had a large portion taking place in the RPD and then in the Umbrella Labs, so we didn't get to see too much of the Raccoon City streets, which is understandable. Resident Evil 3 on the other hand took place on the streets at surface level, and while we got an okay amount of streets to explore, it can get very old very quickly. There are only a handful of small street set pieces, and even then you feel like you're condensed to a city block opposed to a massive city full of the undead. In the original game we did get quite a lot of areas of the city, so not having them in the remake once again just took a lot away from the potential that this game had. And as I said before, they also cut proper locations that were in the original, like the Clock Tower and Raccoon Park, so this only made it worse that they didn't emphasise how big the city actually is and make it more explorable for the player. The main antagonist of Resident Evil 3 is Nemesis, hence why the original is called Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. In both the original and the remake, Nemesis shows up consistently throughout the story, slowly becoming stronger and stronger until you finally fight the fully mutated version at the end. The remake left many fans feeling the Tyrant was underutilised, and of course a lot of the criticism comes from how it was utilised in the original RE3 compared to the remakes. One of the main annoyances came from how scripted Nemesis felt throughout. If it wasn't a set boss battle, many of the segments were chase sequences that were very linear and not something that would diversify as the game progressed. The AI definitely could have been made more adaptive and responsive to the player's actions, making playthroughs more diverse in how events played out for city segments of the game at the very least. The player was never really forced to think on their feet quickly to get away from the monster, and this was something they could have easily changed if they approached it differently. They could have easily have adapted how Mr. X was appearing in the RPD to fit the streets of Raccoon City, and this once again reinforces the point I made before of how they should have opened up the city even more to allow for this type of scenario to take place. So due to the brief and condensed street locations, it also limits what can be done with the Nemesis encounters. A wider and more expansive open city would have allowed for more situations and possibilities with how Nemesis targets the player, but once again the release harboured the simplified streets of Raccoon City, and therefore the public release version of the remake had this unfortunate drawback. One of the biggest complaints for this remake was the cut content from the original game, and of course I have mentioned this briefly earlier in the video, but those being the Clock Tower and Raccoon Park locations. These were two of the most prominent and memorable missing locations that were in the original game but not in the remake. The visit in the remake is extremely brief for the Clock Tower and is non-existent for Raccoon Park, and it pretty much bears no value to most players in the remake, as you literally just fight Nemesis near the Clock Tower and then it completely skips over all of what the original game covers in that location. And I feel like there's many opportunities throughout the game where they could have implemented the location in a substantial gameplay way, but the direction was clearly heading elsewhere in this case, which was extremely unfortunate. Another missing feature from the original is branching story elements. The original RE3 had various points in the story where the player is able to make a choice, and this would affect how the story was told. And while the effect it had on the story was quite minuscule and not too impactful to the overarching story, it added an additional level of replayability and enhanced the overall immersion. As to why this feature was cut, I think this simply falls back on the development idea of having the story in the remakes more focused and consistent, opposed to having multiple timelines with only one actually being canon, like in the original RE1, 2 and 3. There are some additional features that I think also would have been very beneficial to the game, especially in the way it actually released, as this would have acted as additional content or even replacement content and added additional playtime without changing their intent for the remake's narrative. And the main one that I can think of, and it is quite an obvious one, and that is the Mercenaries mode. This would have been a great chance to create a roster of characters based on their RE2 and 3 designs, and possibly even characters from RE1 like Chris and Wesker, and make it a Mercenaries mode where the locations are taken from various areas of Raccoon City. I don't think I need to explain this point too much, as we've had multiple iterations of the Mercenaries mode so far, and in general it's a mode that always tends to hit the mark, even in games such as RE6, where in general it's not got the best reception, but if there is one positive across the board that generally comes up, that is the Mercenaries mode. Back in 2020, following the game's release, we did get an idea floating around of having a director's cut of the Resident Evil 3 remake, as of course many were not satisfied with the content we were given in the base public release. I think a good way of summing up this release is a good game that had a ridiculous amount of untapped potential and was slightly too short as well. And given how long it's been since its release, and with the release of Resident Evil Village and 4's remake since then, it seems like this is something that Capcom doesn't have on their radar at all for the time being. But it isn't all dark skies. Many are looking ahead to a potential remake of RE5, or even one of the older entries like RE1 or Code Veronica as the next Resident Evil release, not to mention the potential for them to finally move on to the final game of the latest trilogy, Resident Evil 9, and 2020's RE3 has been left behind. Hopefully all those years didn't confuse you. But whether that's a good thing or bad thing that they left RE3 behind, let me know down below in the comments if you would like to see a director's cut, of Resident Evil 3's remake, or if you think it's been long enough and it's better off just leaving it in the dust. And I look forward to reading all of your comments and seeing how the discussion continues. As always, a like would be extremely appreciated if you did enjoy. It does help out the channel a ton, and subscribe for a lot more Resident Evil content. Don't forget to join our Discord, links at the top of the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.